Chapter 1. The Weight of Ice. The humidity clung to me like a shroud, thick and suffocating. It wasn't the kind of rain that cleansed, but one that seeped into your bones. A damp, insistent pressure. I hauled on the rope, the frozen slab of glacial ice a leaden weight beneath my hands. The rhythmic groan of the rope, a counterpoint to the ceaseless drone of the district. The lower slums of Athelgard pulsed with a desperate energy, a tangle of corrugated iron shacks, makeshift stalls, and the ever-present stink of sweat, dust, and something vaguely rotten. It was, to put it mildly, a far cry from the chill, surgically maintained environment of the Frost-Vane Conglomerate's orbital research platforms. My name is Kaelen Frost. Or, more accurately, it's the name they think I go by. Officially, I'm the sole heir to the Frost-Vane Conglomerate, a dynasty built on the control of planet-wide freshwater distribution, and crucially, terraforming technology. Unofficially, I'm currently a portable ice block, a glorified shivering delivery boy for the notoriously corrupt merchant, Silas Thorne. I chose this particular profession, this particular layer of grime, as a deliberate act of obfuscation, a shield against the calculating gaze of my family. Disappearing wasn't a difficult decision. It was a consequence of watching my father, Grand Director Kaelen Frost, systematically dismantle my life, piece by piece, in a boardroom battle over strategic resource allocation. The work was brutal. The ice blocks, harvested from the perpetually frozen peaks of the northern ridge, were enormous, weighing close to a ton each. Dragging them through the oppressive heat of Athelgard was a deliberate degradation, a constant reminder of my supposed lack of worth. I had deliberately chosen this path, this physical discomfort, as a way of distancing myself from the icy logic of my heritage, a logic that valued influence and wealth above all else. My hands were perpetually numb, the skin stretched and cracked, the constant friction a dull, persistent ache. Captain Helios, the self-appointed protector of the lower slums, and more accurately the architect of its misery, delighted in this. He seemed to take a particular sadistic pleasure in observing my discomfort. Still shivering, Frost? Head bellow, his voice a gravelly rasp amplified by the surrounding chaos. Head be standing on a makeshift platform, a cadre of Sun King guards surrounding him, their faces etched with bored contempt. The cold is a tool for the rich and a slow death for the poor. Wouldn't you agree? Head then theatrically raise a high-output plasma torch, the device humming with contained energy, aimed directly at my hands. Let's see if your frost-bitten fingers can withstand a little refinement. The guards, a collection of hardened mercenaries recruited from the lower districts, a rotating roster of broken men and desperate youths, would snigger, anticipating the agonizing spectacle. I never resisted. Not overtly, at least. It was a performance, a carefully constructed tableau designed to erode my spirit, and, if he were truly clever, to underestimate me. Today, a few of them were particularly vocal. "He's wasting away, Captain." A pathetic spectacle. One sneered, wiping sweat from his brow with a stained rag. Helios simply chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Indeed. Perhaps a little motivation is in order. He gestured, and a young guard, barely older than 15, lumbered forward, brandishing a hot iron brand. Suddenly a hand flashed out, intercepting the brand. It was Mira. She worked as a water purifier, a vital role in the slums, repairing the intricate network of filtration systems that kept the district's meager water supply from complete contamination. She was a small woman, compact and strong, with calloused hands and eyes that held an unsettling depth of knowledge. She looked up at Helios, her expression a mixture of defiance and weary amusement. "Leave him be, Captain. He's already suffering enough." Helios scoffed. "A nuisance. Remove her." Before I could even react, Shed moved with unexpected speed, knocking the guard aside. The brand hissed against her forearm, leaving a black, smoking impression. She didn't scream, didn't flinch. Just a brief flash of pain, quickly masked by a grimace. "Careful," she murmured, pulling a small, clear flask from her belt and pouring a few drops of a pale blue liquid onto the burn. The liquid immediately began to cool the skin, the discoloration fading almost instantly. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse, barely audible above the din. It was a simple gesture, a fleeting moment of connection, but it resonated with a force I hadn't expected. Mira didn't offer any thanks. She simply returned to her work, carefully repairing a fractured filter valve, her movements precise and efficient. I watched her, noticing the way she handled the ice, not with the frantic shivering of someone battling the heat, but with a rhythmic grace, a deliberate control of her breath. There was something unusual about it. Something that hinted at an inherent understanding of temperature, of energy, that seemed utterly incongruous with a simple water purifier. A seed of an unsettling thought began to take root. Was she aware of what I was capable of? Chapter 2. Echoes of the Stillness. The immediate aftermath of the equinox drought felt less like a victory and more like a fractured shard of glass settling into place. The air still hung thick, with the smell of burnt ozone and desperation, and the stunned faces of the guards, frozen mid-threat, were a testament to the abrupt, horrifying shift of reality. Helios, predictably, was incandescent with rage, pacing before the High Director, Lyra, his face a mask of furious disbelief. "Impossible!" he roared, his voice amplified by the implanted comm gear in his skull. "A simple ice hauler. You call that a sovereign of the void? It's a fabrication, a delusion." Lyra, a woman sculpted from polished obsidian and glacial disdain, simply observed him with an unnerving calm. She was a creature of quiet power, radiating an aura of icy control that seemed to subtly chill the already damp air. "The truth, Captain," she said, her voice a precise, measured monotone, "is often stranger than fiction. And Kaelen Frost possesses a power far beyond human comprehension." Kaelen, standing apart from the chaos, felt a familiar disquiet. The initial exhilaration of unleashing the absolute zero was already fading, replaced by the heavy weight of his secret, the terrifying realization of the depths of his own potential. He found himself drawn to Mira, her unwavering focus on the intricate machinery, a silent counterpoint to the frenetic energy surrounding him. He approached her, cautiously. "You said his a delusion?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Mira didn't look up. "He became a delusion, Kaelen. A necessary one. Before, he was just a shivering boy carrying frozen blocks. Now, his ease, a force." She was carefully analyzing a miniature hydraulic pump, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The energy signatures I detected during the event were unlike anything I've ever encountered. It wasn't simply cold. It was a disruption. A localized cessation of entropy." Kaelen instinctively braced himself. He knew what she meant. The absolute zero wasn't just about freezing things, it was about manipulating the very flow of time and energy around him. He shifted his weight, unconsciously, and a faint shimmer distorted the air around his hands. A barely perceptible ripple of cold. Mira finally looked up. Her eyes, the color of polished jade, widened slightly. "You're aware," she stated, her voice hushed. "You control it." He offered a curt nod, attempting to mask his surprise. "It's instinctive. A response to extreme stress." He hoped that was enough. He couldn't explain the millennia-old training ingrained within his bones, the lineage of frost kings and ice lords. "The fluid you applied to the burn," Mira continued, picking up the flask again, "it's not just a standard coolant. It's compounded with trace elements, rare earth minerals, harvested from the polar deeps, designed to counteract a rapid cooling effect. You were manipulating the molecular structure as you applied it, slowing the rate of thermal transfer." He watched her, captivated, As she meticulously mixed the blue liquid with a handheld device, the rhythmic whir of the machine oddly soothing in the tense atmosphere. "You've been studying me?" he asked, a flicker of suspicion in his voice. "I've been observing," she corrected gently. "And I've been learning. Your body, it resonates with the very principles behind the absolute zero. It's a remarkable anomaly." She paused, considering. "I believe the conglomerate has been searching for someone like you for centuries." Suddenly a harsh voice cut through the air. "Investigation complete. Captain Helios. We've identified the anomaly." It was Silas, a crisp, efficient officer from the conglomerate's intelligence division, accompanied by a squad of heavily armed enforcers. Silas, a man known for his unsettlingly precise manner and an unnerving habit of folding his hands in perfect, symmetrical angles, held up a small, metallic device. "This sensor detects localized fluctuations in thermodynamic fields," Silas announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "The readings confirm the Sovereign's claims. The individual, Kaelen Frost, is indeed a conduit for a highly unstable, potentially catastrophic martial art." Lyra stepped forward, her presence instantly commanding respect. "Silas, you are to secure Mr. Frost. A thorough examination of his capabilities is required. And Captain Helios," she added, her voice laced with ice, "your continued incompetence will not be tolerated." As the enforcers moved to apprehend Kaelen, he realized he couldn't simply surrender. The High Director's interest, coupled with the conglomerate's relentless pursuit of power, posed a threat far greater than Helios' casual cruelty. He focused his mind, drawing on the ingrained instinct, the chilling surge of power that had revealed itself during the equinox drought. The air around him shimmered, the temperature plummeted with an unseen force, and the enforcers froze mid-step, their weapons suspended in the air, encased in shimmering ice. Kaelen simply raised a hand, a faint smile playing on his lips. The game had begun, and he had already revealed a sliver of his true, terrifying power. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Void. The enforcers, a bristling wall of polished chrome and lethal intent, stood frozen, not in a picturesque tableau of winter's beauty, but in a grotesque parody of suspended animation. Their movements, their expressions, even the slight tremor in their hands before the moment of action, were all captured in a cage of iridescent ice. It wasn't a dramatic, shattering freeze like the one during the drought. It was precise, calculated, and utterly terrifying. Silas, his face an impassive mask, took a single, deliberate step forward, his hand extended, holding the metallic device, a small, palm-sized sphere, humming with a faint internal blue light. He tapped the device against one of the frozen enforcers' helmets. "Remarkable," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "The saturation level is off the charts. The Sovereign's ability isn't just a manipulation of temperature, it's a direct, localized disruption of the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. We're observing temporal stasis, essentially." Lyra, the High Director's second-in-command, a woman sculpted from granite and determination, surveyed the scene with a cold, analytical gaze. "Impressive, Silas, but ultimately a demonstration of power. We need to understand the limits, the control. This isn't a weapon to be unleashed, it's a variable we must quantify." She signaled to a team of technicians, who immediately began scanning the frozen enforcers with sophisticated diagnostic equipment. Kaelen, leaning against a crumbling brick wall, watched the unfolding scene with a weary amusement. The conglomerate's reaction was exactly as had anticipated, a flurry of scientific jargon and detached observation, utterly failing to grasp the fundamental feeling of wielding the absolute zero. Had chosen this moment, this deliberately staged confrontation, to demonstrate not just his power, but the deliberate, almost artistic nature of its application. "You see," he said, his voice carefully modulated, "it's not about brute force. It's about stillness, about arresting the chaotic dance of existence." He subtly shifted his weight, a ripple of cold emanating from him, reinforcing the existing ice formations around the frozen enforcers. Suddenly, a harsh, metallic voice cut through the tension. "Hold it, Frost. Don't even think about escalating this." It was Captain Helios, his face contorted with rage, flanked by two particularly burly enforcers who moved with a frantic, almost panicked energy. Had been positioned near the periphery of the scene, a snarl permanently etched on his face. Helios activated a series of handheld thermal projectors, aiming them at Kaelen. The devices pulsed with intense heat, attempting to melt the localized cold surrounding him. But the effect was muted. The heat seemed to simply dissipate against the pervasive chill, failing to penetrate the ice barrier surrounding Kaelen's form. Silas, observing this, adjusted the settings on his device. The projection's energy signature is being heavily influenced by the Sovereign's field. It's dampening. Interesting. Kaelen wasn't trying to defend himself. He wasn't fighting. He was observing, analyzing, and subtly manipulating the situation. He reached out, not to strike, but to touch the sleeve of one of Helios' enforcers. The man gasped, his arm instantly encased in a thick layer of ice, his movements stiff and jerky. "You're wasting your energy, Captain," Kaelen said, his voice laced with a chilling calm. "You're fighting against the very nature of this power. It's not about destruction, it's about control." As he spoke, a faint, crystalline hum filled the air. The air shimmered again, this time with a sharper, more concentrated cold. A dozen more enforcers, drawn by the escalating chaos, began to freeze, their faces frozen in expressions of bewildered horror. This wasn't a sudden, overwhelming surge, it was a carefully orchestrated cascade, each individual frozen with agonizing precision, a testament to Kaelen's mastery. Lyra, her face a mask of controlled fury, barked orders. "Contain the perimeter. Secure the Sovereign. Silas, initiate Phase 2 neural dampening." Silas nodded, and activated another device, a wrist-mounted unit that emitted a pulsating wave of energy. The frozen enforcers, trapped within their icy prisons, began to experience vivid, disjointed hallucinations, flashes of blinding white, distorted memories, and the unsettling sensation of their own existence ceasing to be. Kaelen knew he was nearing a critical point. The conglomerate's technology, while impressive, was fighting a fundamentally impossible battle against the absolute zero. He focused his intent, drawing on the chilling silence within himself. The air around him vibrated with power, and a tendril of absolute cold reached out, not to freeze, but to isolate. Suddenly, the frozen enforcers weren't just immobile, they were becoming empty. Their eyes glazed over. Their movements ceased, and their very consciousness seemed to be drained away, leaving behind only perfectly preserved, crystalline shells. Kaelen had achieved something far more profound than simple stasis, had severed their connection to the flow of time, to their own existence. "Impressive," Silas said, his voice now tinged with genuine awe. "The Sovereign isn't just manipulating temperature. He's recalibrating reality itself." Chapter 4. Echoes of Stillness. The aftermath of the equinox drought was a bizarre tableau of frozen chaos and stunned silence. The Sun King's barracks, once a symbol of oppressive control, resembled a cathedral sculpted from ice. 50 frozen soldiers, each a miniature monument to Kaelen's devastating power, lay scattered across the plaza, their weapons shattered, their uniforms coated in a glittering frost. The air itself seemed to hum with the residual energy of the stillness state, a subtle vibration that prickled the skin. Silas, the conglomerate's lead neuroengineer, circled Kaelen with the detached curiosity of a scientist, observing a particularly complex specimen. "The neural dampening was a tactical necessity, Sovereign," he explained, adjusting the readings on his wrist unit. "It amplified the effects of your power, accelerating the process. However, its limitations are significant. Prolonged exposure leads to instability, a fracturing of the subject's psyche. The hallucinations were a desperate measure to mitigate that risk." Kaelen, despite the recent explosion of his abilities, felt a profound weariness. The exertion of the absolute zero was like a constant, grinding pressure against his soul. He nodded, acknowledging Salas' assessment. It was an inefficient application of resources, he said, his voice low and measured. The goal was containment, not dissection. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the plaza. One of the crystalline soldiers shifted, a flicker of movement within its frozen form. Silas instantly reactivated his wrist unit, emitting a concentrated pulse. The soldier froze again, its glazed eyes returning to their vacant stare, but a faint, shimmering distortion hung in the air around it, a ghostly echo of the momentary lucidity. "The dampening isn't foolproof," Silas stated grimly. "The Sovereign's touch is fundamentally disruptive. It's like throwing a pebble into a perfectly still lake. The ripples spread, but the core remains untouched. These are merely echoes." Just then, High Director Lyra arrived, flanked by a squad of heavily armored conglomerate enforcers. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of controlled concern, but Kaelen detected a flicker of something darker beneath a simmering resentment, a recognition of the power he now wielded. "Kaelen," she said, her voice cold and clipped, "you have demonstrated remarkable potential. However, you have also irrevocably altered the balance. The conglomerate will be overseeing your training, ensuring your abilities are honed for the benefit of the corporation." Kaelen met her gaze, refusing to yield. "The benefit of the corporation is predicated on the equitable distribution of resources," he said, the words resonating with a quiet conviction. "Something your family has consistently failed to achieve." He wasn't arguing, he was stating a truth that the boardroom had long ignored. He felt a subtle shift within himself, a strengthening of the connection to the absolute zero. He didn't consciously initiate it, but the air around him began to chill, the faint vibration intensifying. This time, however, it wasn't focused on individual targets. Kaelen wasn't attempting to freeze or isolate. Instead, he was reaching out, not with force, but with a profound sense of stillness. He focused on Lyra, on the intricate network of power and ambition that drove her, on the weight of generations of corporate greed. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Lyra's movements faltered, her expression clouded with confusion. The air around her shimmered, distorting the light. Then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, she froze. Not in the rigid, crystalline state that had gripped guards, but in a deeper, more profound stillness, a cessation of thought, a suspension of will. Silas stared, his jaw agape. "Impossible," he whispered, his fingers frantically adjusting the settings on his wrist unit. The dampening it wasn't working. It was reversed. Kaelen observed the scene with a quiet intensity. He understood now. The absolute zero wasn't just about freezing matter, it was about severing connection to momentum, to desire, to the very flow of existence. He hadn't defeated Lyra with brute force, but with the ultimate negation, the removal of her will to act. The implications of this discovery hung heavy in the air. The conglomerate's technology, with its complex algorithms and meticulously crafted devices, was ultimately vulnerable to the raw, primal power of the absolute zero. It was a power that defied logic, a force that sought not to control, but to simply undo. As the conglomerate enforcers reacted in stunned silence, Kaelen turned his attention to Mira, who had cautiously approached the plaza, her face etched with a mixture of fear and fascination. He extended a hand towards her, and a gentle tendril of cold enveloped her, not freezing her, but soothing her. "You are not a tool, Mira," he said, his voice soft. "You are a beacon. And together we can rebuild this world, not with power and control, but with stillness and respect." Chapter 5. Echoes of Stillness. The silence following Kaelen's demonstration in the plaza was thick with disbelief and nascent dread. The Sun Kings, a force built on intimidation and technological superiority, were reduced to shivering, useless figures, their plasma weapons frozen mid-discharge, their movements jerky and uncertain. Silas, the head engineer of the conglomerate's monitoring division, remained rooted to the spot, his wrist unit a useless tangle of wires, his face a mask of horrified fascination. He was the first to articulate the unspoken fear the conglomerate's control systems, reliant on predictive algorithms and constant data streams, were fundamentally incompatible with the absolute zero. It's like a logic loop, Silas stammered, his voice strained. The system doesn't understand the cessation. It registers nothing, anticipates nothing. It's an absence, not a signal. Kaelen didn't press him. He understood the inherent discomfort in confronting a power so alien, so inherently disruptive to their carefully constructed reality. He needed to buy time, to assess the situation, and more importantly, to understand the deeper mechanisms of the absolute zero. The initial revelation, the shattering of the plasma torch, the incapacitation of the guards felt like a blunt instrument. This silent negation of will, felt potent. Mira, meanwhile, had taken a tentative step closer, her eyes wide with a cautious curiosity. The lingering chill around her, rather than frightening her, seemed to have a calming effect. She reached out a hand, hesitantly touching the slick surface of a frozen puddle, a small, glittering testament to Kaelen's power. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice soft, like a winter's dream. Kaelen inclined his head, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "It's not a dream, Mira. It's an echo. The echo of stillness." He extended his hand again, this time reaching for her. As his fingers brushed her wrist, the air around her shimmered with a subtle frost, a miniature replica of the larger display. But this time, it wasn't a paralyzing freeze. It was a gentle slowing, a momentary dampening of her own movements, as if Shed stepped into a viscous fluid. "You can feel it, can't you?" he asked, his voice laced with a quiet intensity. Not as a threat, but as a release. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, Director Lyra, Kaelen's sister, her face a mask of cold calculation. She was accompanied by two heavily armed conglomerate enforcers, their weapons trained on Kaelen and Mira. "Brother," Lyra's voice was laced with icy displeasure, "this is a dangerous display. You've revealed a power that threatens the stability of the conglomerate. You will be brought back to the Citadel for immediate debriefing and containment." Kaelen simply observed her, his expression unchanged. He didn't attempt to use the absolute zero. He didn't need to. The mere presence of the conglomerate's forces, their arrogance and their belief in their technological superiority, was enough to weaken their resolve. As Lyra advanced, Kaelen subtly shifted his stance, a barely perceptible adjustment that resonated with a deeper stillness. He focused not on attacking, but on observing, on understanding. And then, without a word, he activated the absolute zero. This time, it wasn't a localized burst of freezing energy. It was a wave, a subtle pulse that spread outwards from him, washing over Lyra and her enforcers. It wasn't about freezing their bodies. It was about freezing their intentions, their desires, their very will to act. Lyra's hand, poised to draw her weapon, froze mid-air. Her face, previously contorted with suspicion and anger, smoothed out into a mask of vacant serenity. The enforcers, their movements suddenly jerky and uncoordinated, began to fumble with their weapons, their fingers seemingly unable to obey their commands. It was a breathtaking display of power, a silent, absolute negation that left them utterly helpless. "You see, sister?" Kaelen said, his voice calm and measured. "The conglomerate isn't built on force. It's built on assumptions. Assumptions about control, about predictability, about the inevitability of outcomes." He gestured to the stunned faces of Lyra and her enforcers. "You assumed you could control me. You assumed you could control the world. You were wrong." As the initial shock wore off, Silas, driven by a desperate need to understand, cautiously approached Kaelen. He began running diagnostics on his wrist unit, frantically adjusting the settings, attempting to analyze the data stream. It's like a ghost in the machine," he exclaimed, his voice laced with a mixture of awe and terror. "The data is there, but it's not being processed. It's as ethos, if the system is being erased before it can even record it." Kaelen simply nodded. "The absolute zero isn't just about stopping things," he said. "It's about questioning everything." He turned to Mira, who was watching the scene with a profound sense of understanding. "Our world, Mira, is built on the constant struggle, the endless pursuit of progress, of growth, of change. But sometimes, the greatest progress is found not in action, but in stillness." Chapter 6. Echoes of the Void. The aftermath of Kaelen's unveiling was a maelstrom of bewildered whispers and frantic calculations. Silas, his face slick with sweat, continued his obsessive scans, the wrist unit a useless tangle of flickering lights and indecipherable symbols. He was chasing a phantom, a disruption in the data that shouldn't have existed, a ghostly absence of impact where colossal power had been unleashed. "It's resisting analysis, Kaelen," he reported, his voice strained. "The readings are incoherent, as if the event itself never truly happened. It's like the moment of absolute stillness created a paradox, a ripple that fractured the very fabric of observation." Lyra, initially frozen in stunned silence, recovered with a brittle composure. Her enforcers, still shivering slightly, were being re-evaluated, their combat protocols scrutinized with a detached, almost clinical interest. Captain Helios, stripped of his rank and now shivering in the unnervingly cold air, was being escorted towards the glacial cliffs of the southern sea, a task assigned to a squad of the most stoic, rigorously trained guards, a punishment designed not just to chill his bones, but to erode his pride. Kaelen, meanwhile, was observing the unfolding chaos with a measured detachment, a faint smile playing on his lips. He wasn't reveling in his power, not yet. He was studying the reaction, the disbelief, the fear, the desperate attempts to categorize what they'd witnessed. He realized with a quiet satisfaction that his appearance hadn't simply demonstrated his power, it had exposed a fundamental flaw in the conglomerate's understanding of reality. "You've built your empire on data, Silas," Kaelen said, turning to his reluctant advisor. "On probabilities, projections, and predictive algorithms. What happens when the system itself ceases to function according to those rules? What happens when you confront something that defies prediction, something that simply is, without needing to be defined?" Silas, clearly struggling to comprehend, simply shook his head. "It defies all known physics, Kaelen. The energy expenditure alone, it shouldn't have been possible. It's like you manipulated the laws of thermodynamics themselves." "Perhaps," Kaelen conceded, "the laws of thermodynamics are simply a human construct, a convenient framework we impose on a universe far more complex than we understand." He turned his gaze to Mira, who was standing quietly, absorbing the scene with an unsettlingly calm intensity. "The absolute zero isn't just about freezing matter, Mira. It's about entering a state of heightened awareness, a state where the limitations of perception fade away." He paused, his eyes reflecting the shimmering snow. "It's about seeing the potential within everything, the inherent stillness that underlies all movement, all change." Suddenly, a tremor ran through the ground, not violent, but a subtle shift in the earth's vibration. The air grew thick with an unnatural cold, and the falling snow intensified, swirling around them in a miniature blizzard. Silas, frantically adjusting his wrist unit, let out a strangled cry. "The readings! They're spiking. The residual energy from the stillness state, it's not fading. It's amplifying." Kaelen's expression hardened. He raised his hand, not in aggression, but in a gesture of controlled focus. The blizzard around them vanished as quickly as it had begun, replaced by an unnervingly silent, crystalline stillness. "This isn't simply a demonstration of power, Silas," he said, his voice low and resonant. "This is an echo. The absolute zero doesn't just stop time, it opens a pathway to a different temporal dimension. A space where the past, present, and future are inextricably linked. And by engaging with that dimension, even for a fraction of a second, we've created a resonance, a ripple that continues to propagate." He turned to Mira, his eyes filled with a profound intensity. "Our family has been guarding this secret for generations, believing it to be a weapon to be wielded, a tool to be controlled. But it is not a weapon, Mira. It is a key to understanding the true nature of reality." He took a step towards her, and for a moment, the air around them shimmered with an ethereal light. He reached out, not to touch her, but to extend his hand as if to grasp the very concept of stillness. The conglomerate seeks to dominate the flow of time, to predict and control every event. But the greatest strength lies not in control, but in understanding. And in stillness, we can begin to truly understand. As he spoke, a single drop of water materialized on Mira's cheek, suspended in midair, refracting the ambient light into a miniature rainbow. It remained there for a moment, perfectly formed, before dissolving back into the falling snow, a silent testament to the echo of the void. The realization dawned on Silas. They weren't just fighting a tyrannical corporation, they were wrestling with the fundamental nature of existence itself. Chapter 7. The Silver Echo. The following days after the equinox drought were a whirlwind of stunned disbelief and burgeoning whispers. Kaelen, now known as the Frost Weaver, moved with an unsettling grace through the slums, a silent, crystalline guardian. The Sun Kings, demoralized and bewildered, were reduced to a nervous, twitching force, constantly adjusting their tactics and avoiding direct confrontation. Captain Helios, stripped of his authority and clad in a ragged gray uniform, was a shadow of his former self, relegated to the ice shelves, a frozen monument to hubris. Kaelen's actions hadn't simply ended the drought, they had revealed a horrifying truth about the Frost-Vane Conglomerate. The initial shock had given way to a cautious curiosity. Driven largely by Silas, the conglomerate's chief archivist, a man previously consumed by meticulous data analysis, and now obsessed with deciphering the events of that single terrifying night. Silas, a man of meticulous habit, had been a figure of quiet resentment for Kaelen, viewing him as a reckless disruption of established order. Now, he was a frantic, almost manic study of the Frost Weaver, meticulously documenting every instance of Kaelen's power, every shimmering ripple of the stillness state. "The resonance," Silas muttered constantly, scribbling furiously in his notebook. "The resonance is far more complex than we anticipated. The absolute zero isn't just a freezing technique, it's a conduit." Mira, meanwhile, was undergoing a transformation of her own. Initially, she'd been wary of Kaelen, understandably so. The sudden, inexplicable manifestation of absolute zero power was a disruption to her carefully constructed world of hydraulics and recycled water. But she couldn't deny the undeniable: Kaelen had saved her life, and potentially countless others. She began to approach him with a hesitant respect, intrigued by his calm, measured demeanor and the strange, almost ancient knowledge that seemed to emanate from him. Kaelen, in turn, sought her out regularly, often found observing her meticulously repairing a complex desalination unit. He didn't offer advice, didn't explain his powers. Instead, he would simply watch, a quiet intensity in his pale blue eyes, occasionally offering a single, perfectly formed snowflake as a gesture of acknowledgement. One evening, as Mira worked late, meticulously calibrating a pump, Kaelen materialized beside her, a silent observer. "You believe this is simply a matter of water," he said, his voice a low hum, barely audible above the whirring machinery. Mira looked up, surprised. It is at its core. But water is so much more than just H2O. It's the lifeblood of this city, the memory of rainfall, the echo of the mountains. Kaelen nodded slowly. You speak of echoes. Silas believes the absolute zero generates a temporal resonance, a ripple in the fabric of time. He hypothesizes that our ancestors didn't simply freeze objects, they were interacting with moments in the past, shaping potential futures. He gestured towards a shimmering patch of snow on the ground, where a single, perfectly preserved lotus flower lay frozen in time. This lotus wasn't simply frozen. It was remembered. Suddenly, the air around them shimmered, intensifying the effect of the falling snow. A small spectral image flickered into existence, a young woman, dressed in archaic silks, meticulously tending a garden filled with identical lotus flowers. The image was fleeting, a ghost of a moment, before dissolving back into the snow, leaving behind a faint scent of jasmine. Mira gasped, instinctively reaching out to touch the spot where the image had been, but her hand passed through empty air. What? Dune. What was that? She stammered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Kaelen turned to her, a subtle smile playing on his lips. The conglomerate's founders weren't just industrialists, they were Cryo-Masters. They used the absolute zero to subtly alter events, to consolidate their power, to ensure the conglomerate's continued existence. They weren't simply controlling water, they were controlling time itself. And for generations, they've been suppressing the knowledge of this legacy, fearing the consequences of such power. He paused, his gaze locking with Mira's. But now, the echo has been stirred, and it's leading us to a deeper truth. He reached out, not to touch her, but to extend his hand, palm open, as if inviting her to step into the shimmering space between moments. Let us see what they were trying to hide. The air thrummed with an ethereal energy, and for a brief, terrifying instant, Mira felt herself tumbling through a cascade of fragmented images, a lavish banquet, a tense council meeting, a desperate struggle for control, all layered within the same, frozen instant. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. She stood there, breathless, the cold of the snow burning in her skin, acutely aware of the incredible weight of the secret she was now privy to. The echo of the void, it seemed, had revealed its first chilling truth. Chapter 8. The shards of remembrance. Mira stumbled back, her hand instinctively clutching at her arm, still aching from the phantom burn of the plasma torch. The lingering scent of jasmine was now overlaid with something else, something ancient, metallic, like cold iron, and the ghosts of frozen moments. You're saying my family, my ancestors, were manipulating events? Using this absolute zero? Her voice was a breathless whisper, laced with disbelief and a burgeoning, terrifying understanding. Kaelen nodded slowly, the subtle grace of his movements still tinged with the unnatural stillness of the absolute zero. The conglomerate's origins are far more complex than the boardrooms you've witnessed. They weren't simply securing water rights, they were crafting the very flow of history. Each shift, each strategic investment, each carefully orchestrated accident, a frozen river diverting trade routes, a strategically failed terraforming project, forcing a populace to relocate, was a calculated act of temporal manipulation. He gestured towards the shimmering residue of snow clinging to the cracked concrete of the slum. This isn't a spontaneous event, Mira. This was a carefully calibrated release, a momentary fracture in the natural order. The conglomerate's predecessors used the absolute zero to prevent disasters, to steer nations towards beneficial outcomes, to preserve their own dominance. They didn't see themselves as tyrants, they saw themselves as custodians of stability, albeit ones wielding a terrifyingly potent tool. A low rumble echoed from the direction of the dropships, a sound that vibrated through the very ground. The High Director, Lyra, emerged, flanked by two heavily armed enforcers. Her face was a mask of carefully controlled composure, though Kaelen noted a flicker of something akin to apprehension in her eyes. "The echo is escalating, Heir," she said, her voice crisp and measured. The conglomerate's records, meticulously sealed for centuries, are responding to your activation. We've detected fluctuations in the temporal fabric across multiple zones. Your demonstration in the slums has triggered a cascade. Demonstration? Kaelen repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He wasn't seeking a demonstration, he was seeking answers. A way to understand the darkness that had shaped his life. You're saying the conglomerate has been operating as a silent puppeteer for generations? Lyra's gaze sharpened. Precisely. And we now face a critical juncture. The revelation of your lineage and your ability has destabilized the conglomerate's carefully constructed reality. The knowledge of the absolute zero is a weapon, a temptation. We must understand its true purpose, and more importantly, control its potential misuse. Suddenly, the air shimmered again, this time with a sharper, more focused intensity. The fragments of memory returned, but they were no longer blurred and chaotic. They solidified, coalescing around Kaelen, into a distinct, horrifying scene: a young Lyra, barely 16, standing before a council of elder conglomerate members, her face pale with desperation. She was arguing against a planned glacial dam project, passionately pleading for a more sustainable approach. The council, unmoved, pointed to the data projections showing increased water security, expanded terraforming opportunities, and the potential for greater profit. The absolute zero shimmered briefly around Lyra, freezing her argument mid-sentence, effectively silencing her. The council voted to proceed. The dam was built, and the consequences, a catastrophic flood, a decade later, were conveniently dismissed as natural variation. Mira gasped, a cold dread gripping her. They manipulated her? They used this power to silence her. Kaelen placed a hand on her shoulder, a surprisingly gentle touch. They saw her dissent as a threat. They believed they were acting in the best interests of the conglomerate, even if it meant sacrificing one life. The absolute zero wasn't simply about control. It was about preserving the illusion of control. As the vision faded, a new sensation washed over them, a tremor in the air, a dissonance in the fabric of reality. The snow around them began to swirl with increased intensity, forming intricate fractal patterns that resembled frozen glyphs. A voice, ancient and resonant, echoed within their minds, not spoken, but felt. Beware the shards. Before they could react, a section of the slum wall shattered, revealing not the tropical heat of the equatorial district, but a fractured, desolate landscape, a frozen tundra stretching towards a perpetually twilight sky. Within the frost-covered ruins, they saw a figure, shimmering faintly, a younger version of Kaelen, clad in archaic conglomerate armor, wielding the absolute zero with devastating precision, freezing an entire rebel army in a single, brutal moment. Lyra, her face grim, immediately issued a command. Contain the anomaly. Initiate Protocol Omega-9. Kaelen, suppress the power. You are exceeding your capacity. Kaelen ignored her. He stared at the frozen battlefield, at the young, haunted version of himself. He understood now. The conglomerate hadn't simply sought to control water, they sought to control memory, to erase inconvenient truths, to rewrite the past. And the echo, the residual energy of the absolute zero, wasn't just revealing the past, it was threatening to unravel the very foundation of their reality. The revelation wasn't a gift, it was a warning. The shards of remembrance, it seemed, were about to shatter everything. Chapter 9. The Echo of Obsidian. The immediate aftermath of the slum wall breach was a chaotic ballet of containment. Lyra's Omega-9 protocol, a shimmering field of contained chronal distortion, struggled to stabilize the anomaly. It wasn't a natural rift, not entirely. It felt manufactured, overlaid with a brutal, ancient violence. The fractal snow patterns intensified, swirling into intricate obsidian-like glyphs that pulsed with a frigid light. The echoing voice, the one that had warned, beware the shards, returned, louder this time, laced with a chilling urgency. The weaver is unraveling. The obsidian remembers. Kaelen remained rooted, his gaze fixed on the frozen tableau. The younger him, a boy no older than 15, all sharp angles and terrifying power, was a ghost, a wound in time. He saw not just a battlefield, but a meticulously crafted illusion, a deliberate manipulation. The rebels weren't resisting a tyrannical regime, they were fighting himself. A younger, less burdened version of his own lethal potential. "Lyra, stop the containment field!" he commanded, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "It's feeding the anomaly. It's amplifying the resonance." Lyra, a woman sculpted from steel and logic, hesitated. "Kaelen, you're exponentially increasing your energy expenditure. The conglomerate's safeguards there designed to shut down the absolute zero with a sustained pulse. You're exceeding the threshold." "I'm not just fighting a battle, Lyra," Kaelen said, his hands beginning to subtly vibrate, the air around him cooling. "I'm dismantling a lie dika." He moved, not with the clumsy labor of an ice hauler, but with a fluid, almost predatory grace. He reached out, his fingers extending like polished obsidian, and touched the frozen outline of a fallen rebel soldier. The soldier didn't shatter, didn't become ice. Instead, a ripple of colder air pulsed outwards, briefly dissolving the image, revealing a fleeting moment the soldier raising his rifle, the horrified expression on his face, just before the world froze around him. "The absolute zero isn't just about freezing matter," he muttered, his breath visible in the falling snow. "It's about freezing perception." Suddenly, the glyphs in the air solidified, taking on a more coherent form. They resembled a complex spiraling circuit board, and within the center, a single pulsing shard of obsidian small, no bigger than a clenched fist, materialized. As he watched, the shard grew, radiating an intense cold, disrupting the containment field, and bathing the surrounding area in an ethereal blue light. "The shard is stabilizing," Lyra shouted, her voice strained. "Its energy signature matching your own. It's a reflection, a corrupted echo of the absolute zero." Kaelen realized with a sickening certainty that the older version of himself wasn't simply a warrior, he was a key. The conglomerate hadn't merely developed the absolute zero, they'd engineered a feedback loop, a weapon designed to trap and exploit a warrior's inherent potential, a weapon that could essentially create an infinite supply of him. He lunged forward, driven by a desperate instinct. As he reached for the growing shard, he felt a jarring collision, a rush of cold, a disorientation, and a fragment of memory, sharp and brutal, slammed into his consciousness. He saw himself, in the frozen battlefield, unleashing a torrent of lethal energy, not out of conscious decision, but from a primal, instinctive rage. He saw the casual devastation, the utter annihilation of his enemies. He saw himself, the boy, losing control. The voice, now a guttural whisper, reverberated within him. Control. The shard demands control. He instinctively pulled back, his muscles screaming in protest. The shard pulsed violently, and the slum wall shattered again, this time revealing not a frozen tundra, but a swirling vortex of absolute darkness, filled with the ghosts of countless frozen moments, battles, betrayals, and the agonizing cessation of life. "It's pulling us in, Kaelen," Lyra yelled, desperately activating the Omega-9 field, which now shimmered with an unstable crimson light. "It's feeding on our memories, our fears. We have to sever the connection." Kaelen knew what he had to do. He didn't fight the shard. Instead, he focused, channeling the absolute zero, not to destroy, but to correct. He reached out and touched the obsidian shard, not with force, but with understanding. He didn't try to freeze it. He focused on the feeling, on the moment of brutal control, on the primal rage that had fueled the boy's actions. As his fingers brushed the shard, the glyphs in the air flickered and died. The obsidian shard contracted, shrinking back to its original size. The vortex of darkness receded, leaving behind only a lingering chill and a profound, unsettling silence. You didn't destroy it, Lyra whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. You integrated it. Kaelen looked down at his hand, now radiating a subtle, icy glow. He understood then. The shard wasn't a weapon to be feared. It was a reflection of himself, a warning, a potential, and a chilling reminder of the darkness that lay dormant within. Beware the shards. The voice echoed again, this time, not a warning, but an acceptance. We will remember. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Frost. The air in Kaelen's new sanctuary hummed with a low, persistent thrum, the residual energy of his actions at the equinox drought. Mira, now clad in shimmering, silver-threaded fabrics of practical adaptation to the constantly shifting temperatures, moved with a quiet efficiency, overseeing the construction of a massive filtration system built from harvested glacial ice and advanced sonic resonators. The sanctuary, a testament to her ingenuity, was a breathtaking paradox, a space of cool serenity encased in shimmering, heat-resistant glass, reflecting the humid tropical sky outside. Kaelen, however, remained restless. The memory of the devastation had unleashed, the sheer magnitude of his power, clung to him like frostbite. Had spent the intervening days meticulously studying the ancient texts recovered from the Frost-Vane archives, attempting to decipher the nuances of the absolute zero beyond its destructive potential. He discovered it wasn't simply about stopping movement, but about subtly altering the vibrational frequency of matter, effectively rewriting its state. It was a language of stillness, a manipulation of reality at the most fundamental level. The glyphs, they aren't just warnings, are they? Kaelen asked, turning to Mira as she adjusted a delicate regulator. They're echoes. Residual impressions of events, imprinted onto the fabric of existence by moments of extreme emotional resonance. Mira paused, her brow furrowed. You mean like a phantom scent, but for moments? Powerful ones. Precisely, Kaelen replied, his voice laced with a chilling certainty. The shard was a particularly potent echo, reflecting the moment of my first uncontrolled channeling. But every significant act, every surge of raw power, they leave their mark. The ancient warriors didn't just wield this art, they listened to the echoes. Suddenly, the sanctuary plunged into an unnatural silence. The humming ceased. The air grew thick, heavy with a tangible coldness that wasn't natural, not the crisp, clean chill of the glacial ice. A fine, iridescent frost began to creep across the glass walls. What is happening? Mira asked, her hand instinctively reaching for the thermal regulator shed, crafted a complex device designed to manipulate localized temperature gradients. Kaelen recognized the signs instantly. It was a resonance, a gathering of echoes. He closed his eyes, focusing his mind, consciously attempting to attune himself to the subtle shifts in the ambient energy. He reached out, not with force, but with intent, seeking the source of the disturbance. He saw it then, a shimmering distortion in the air, a miniature vortex mirroring the one head confronted near the Omega-9 field. But this one was smaller, contained, and older. Within the swirling darkness, he witnessed a scene from centuries past, a Frost-Vane warrior, clad in armor, etched with the same glyphs as the shard, engaged in a brutal duel with a rival clan leader. The air crackled with frozen energy, the clash of steel echoing in the void. But this wasn't just a battle. It was a moment of profound betrayal. The warrior, consumed by rage and lust for power, had used the absolute zero not to protect, but to deliver a fatal, exquisitely precise, freezing wound to his opponent. The echo pulsed with that initial, agonizing surge of dark intent. It's feeding, Kaelen whispered, his voice strained. It's drawing energy from the moment of the first corruption. The seed of darkness, it's awakening. Before he could react, a blast of intense cold erupted from the vortex, slamming into him with incredible force. He stumbled backward, shielding his eyes, and realized the frost hadn't just formed on the glass, it was forming on him, solidifying around his arm, wrapping him in a cocoon of absolute zero. Mira, reacting instantly, unleashed the thermal regulator, sending a concentrated wave of heat towards the vortex. But it was too late. The vortex pulsed, growing larger, drawing in more of the surrounding energy. The frost on Kaelen intensified, forming intricate, crystalline patterns on his skin. He felt a searing pain, a wrenching disorientation as the echoes of the warrior's rage flooded his consciousness. He saw himself, a younger, more reckless version of himself, consumed by ambition and fueled by a thirst for vengeance. Then, he understood. This wasn't a threat to be extinguished. It was a lesson, a brutal, agonizing reminder of the path he could have taken. With a monumental effort of will, he shifted his focus, no longer fighting the echo, but integrating it. He reached out, not with force, but with empathy, acknowledging the pain, the rage, the primal instinct for survival that had driven the warrior centuries ago. He didn't suppress the echo, he refined it, channeling the raw energy into a controlled, precise stream of absolute cold, collapsing the vortex into a single, shimmering shard. As the last vestiges of the echo dissipated, the frost on his arm receded, leaving behind a faint, icy shimmer. He looked at Mira, his face etched with exhaustion, and realized something profound. The shards weren't meant to be feared, but to be understood. "We must learn to listen to the echoes," he said, his voice low, "for they hold the key to preventing the darkness from ever returning." Chapter 11. The Architect of Ice. The transition from Sovereign of the Void to Kaelen Frost was unsettling, a subtle yet profound shift in the air around him. The slums of Viridia, once a crucible of humiliation, now hummed with a cautious reverence, a hesitant acknowledgement of the impossible. The frozen snowfields that had erupted during the equinox drought hadn't simply vanished, they'd been meticulously sculpted, forming intricate patterns along the district's canals and around the nascent foundations of Mira's sanctuary, a breathtaking structure of layered glass and shimmering silver, reflecting the perpetually overcast sky like a fallen star. Helios, a broken man reduced to hauling ice alongside the men had scorned, stared at Kaelen with a mixture of hatred and bewildered awe. His attempts to glare at the warrior hauler were met with a glacial indifference, a single, perfectly formed ice shard silently drifting from Kaelen's hand and lodging itself in Helios' boot. You possess the absolute zero," sputtered Commander Theron, Helios' second in command, a man who had once dismissed Kaelen as a fool. It's a myth." Kaelen offered a curt nod, his eyes the color of glacial ice. "Myths often contain a core of truth, Commander. And truth, like water, always finds a way." Mira, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Overseeing the construction of her sanctuary, she directed the placement of heat-resistant polymers, calculated the optimal angle for solar capture through strategically placed lenses, and most astonishingly, began experimenting with the ice itself. She had observed Kaelen's control, his almost meditative manipulation of the cold, and was determined to understand it. Shed built a series of intricate ice-cooling chambers, meticulously monitoring temperature gradients and structural integrity. "The way he manipulates the cold isn't brute force," she explained to a skeptical team of engineers, meticulously tracing patterns on a slab of frozen water with a stylus. "It's resonance. As not simply freezing matter as harmonizing with its molecular structure. It's like tuning an instrument." Kaelen watched her, a quiet satisfaction etched onto his face. Had it intended to use his rediscovered power to punish the elite, to punish his family? But Mira's approach, her insistence on understanding the underlying principles, resonated with him. He realized that the absolute zero wasn't just a weapon, it was a key to unlocking the planet's resources, to preserving life in a world increasingly ravaged by climate change. That evening, After a grueling day of supervising the construction of a new atmospheric condenser, a project designed to capture and purify the increasingly volatile humidity, Kaelen found Mira studying a holographic projection of the Earth's ice caps. The projections, compiled by the Frost-Vane Conglomerate's intelligence network, were riddled with inaccuracies and manipulated data, designed to conceal the devastating impact of their terraforming operations. "They're lying, Kaelen," Mira said, her voice tight with anger. "They've been deliberately destabilizing the polar regions, exploiting the diminishing ice for profit. The data is a facade." Kaelen stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the projection. He activated a small, intricately carved ice shard pendant around his neck, a focusing tool had discovered amongst his family's archives. The pendant pulsed with a faint blue light. As he focused his will, the holographic projection shimmered, fracturing into 1,000 icy fragments. He wasn't simply disrupting the display, he was revealing the underlying truth, a complex network of strategically placed geothermal vents and melting glaciers, a deliberate act of ecological sabotage. "They're using the climate as a weapon," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "and we will not allow them to succeed." Suddenly, the room pulsed with a low, humming vibration. A section of the wall shimmered, resolving into a holographic projection of a young man, his face a distorted reflection of Kaelen's own. It was his father, High Director Silas Frost, addressing a board meeting, his voice cold and calculating. "The equatorial districts represent a significant logistical hurdle," Silas stated, pointing to a map of Iridia overlaid with data streams. "The population is volatile, resistant to corporate influence. Operation Frostbite is authorized. Initiate Phase 1. A targeted economic disruption, followed by a strategic demonstration of force." The echo intensified, its voice growing louder, more insistent. It was a memory, a potential future, a terrifying reminder of the man he could have become. Kaelen fought back, focusing his will, channeling the energy of the absolute zero. The holographic projection flickered, collapsing into a swirling vortex of ice crystals. As the last vestiges of the echo dissipated, leaving behind a lingering chill in the air, Kaelen turned to Mira, his face pale with exertion. "We have to be prepared," he said, his voice strained. "They will try to control us, to use us. We are not tools, Mira. We are architects." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a ripple of cold through her. "And together," he added, a glimmer of hope in his icy eyes, "we will build a world where no one thirsts, and no one is frozen." Chapter 12. The Architect's Blueprint. The scent of ozone and frost clung to the air, a subtle reminder of the battle waged within Kaelen's core. Mira, ever the pragmatist, had already begun assessing the damage not to the physical space, but to the precarious balance they'd established. The holographic projection, a jarring intrusion of Silas' machinations, had left her unnerved. "It was thorough," she said, her brow furrowed as she examined the residual ice crystals clinging to the wall. "He anticipated this. He always does." Kaelen, leaning against a newly constructed counter in Mira's workshop, a marvel of salvaged metal and salvaged glass, remained unusually quiet. The exhaustion from channeling the absolute zero was a draining, almost debilitating experience. It wasn't simply physical. It was a psychic strain, forcing him to confront the ingrained ruthlessness had been desperately trying to suppress. "He believes he's controlling us," Kaelen said, his voice low and deliberate. "Silas doesn't see us as individuals. He sees us as assets, levers to be manipulated." He gestured towards the blueprints sprawling across the workbench, intricate schematics of the global water project's expansion, diagrams of atmospheric condensers, and surprisingly detailed maps of Iridia's subterranean aquifers. "Has already laid the groundwork for a strategic demonstration of force. We need to anticipate his moves, to understand the levers he intends to pull." Mira, observing his focused intensity, realized he wasn't just fighting Silas Frost, he was fighting his own inheritance. "You think Hell send more Sun Kings?" she asked, her hand instinctively reaching for the salvaged thermal wrench she kept close. Likely, Kaelen confirmed grimly. He'll use fear, manipulation, and the cold-blooded efficiency of his security force. Hell, try to isolate us, to make us dependent on him. Suddenly, a low hum, identical to the one that triggered the holographic projection, filled the workshop. The air shimmered again, and a second projection materialized this time. A live feed from a surveillance drone, hovering above the equatorial slums. Captain Helios, looking predictably smug, was addressing a group of Sun Kings, his voice amplified through a speaker. "The vermin are proving resistant," Helios sneered, pointing to a small group of dock workers attempting to repair a damaged water pump. "Clearly, brute force is required. I've authorized a targeted deployment of thermal disruptors. Let's remind them who holds the power." Kaelen's jaw tightened. He recognized the type of disruptor. Miniature flamethrowers designed to rapidly melt ice blocks, and by extension, anything they were holding. It wasn't a sophisticated weapon, but it was a demonstration of control, a chilling reminder of his own vulnerability. "They're escalating," Mira said, her voice tight with urgency. "It is trying to break us." Kaelen stepped forward, his movements fluid and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the Sun Kings. He raised his hand, and a localized frost formed around the drone, freezing its camera lens and disrupting the feed. "Don't react to his provocations," he instructed Mira. His eyes narrowed. "Don't let him dictate our fear." He began to meticulously study the blueprints, his fingers tracing the complex lines with an almost ritualistic precision. "This isn't just about water, Mira. It's about control. He wants to build a fortress of scarcity, to dictate our lives based on the amount of water he deems acceptable." As he worked, a realization dawned on him, a subtle shift in his perspective. Silas' plan wasn't just a calculated attempt to dominate the equatorial districts. It was a reflection of a deeper, more insidious truth about the Frost-Vane Conglomerate. The entire system, from the controlled distribution of water to the manipulation of the climate, was designed to maintain a rigid hierarchy, to ensure the survival of a select few at the expense of the many. "He thinks he's building a legacy," Kaelen said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "But he's actually building a prison." He paused, turning to Mira, his gaze unwavering. "We won't just fight his tactics, Mira. Well, dismantle the system itself. Well, build a network of water purification, of sustainable technology, that's accessible to everyone, not just the elite." He reached out and took her hand again. This time the ripple of cold felt different, warmer, infused with a nascent sense of purpose. "You showed me that even in the darkest corners of Viridia, there's still beauty, still resilience, still a thirst for something better. Let's build that something better, together." The air around them shimmered once more, not with a projection, but with a faint, almost imperceptible hum. Kaelen felt it, a surge of energy, a confirmation that his connection to the absolute zero was growing stronger, more refined. He wasn't just a frozen warrior, he was becoming an architect, not just of water systems, but of a future where cold wasn't a weapon, but a shield. Chapter 13. The echo of stillness, the rain in Viridia. A perpetual sickly gray drizzle seemed to mirror the shift occurring within Kaelen. The victory at the equinox drought hadn't simply secured the equatorial zone, it had triggered a fundamental alteration in his understanding of the Frost-Vane Conglomerate, and more importantly, his role within it. Silas' vision of ruthless optimization was no longer an abstract concept, but a horrifying reality made manifest. Had glimpsed the rot at the core of his family's legacy, and realized he couldn't simply wield absolute zero to correct the imbalance he needed to dismantle the entire foundation. The initial euphoria of returning to Mira's workshop, a surprisingly serene space amidst the grime of the district, was quickly replaced by a focused, almost frantic energy. The sanctuary built for her a breathtaking chamber of polished silver and layered glass. Subtly temperature-controlled, felt less like a reward and more like a crucible. It was here, amidst the hum of repurposed desalination machinery, that Kaelen began sketching, calculating, and meticulously planning. The core issue isn't just the distribution, he explained to Mira, his voice low, meticulously adjusting the temperature of a cooling panel. It's the control. The orbital dropships, the predictive algorithms, the entire network is built on a principle of scarcity. They manipulate weather patterns, ration water, all to maintain a perceived power imbalance. We need to flood the system with access, with efficiency. Mira, ever practical, was busy calibrating a complex array of sensors. You're talking about creating a counter-system, Kaelen. A network that rivals theirs, but one based on open access, on sustainable technology. It's ambitious. Ambitious is an understatement, Kaelen admitted, a flicker of his characteristic grimness returning. Silas is attempting to build a prison. We're going to build a key. He demonstrated, subtly manipulating a small, frozen droplet of water suspended in midair. The air around it shimmered, a miniature echo of the stillness state, and the droplet remained perfectly motionless, defying gravity. The absolute zero isn't just about freezing things, Mira. It's about controlling momentum, disrupting the flow. The following weeks were a blur of activity. Kaelen, leveraging his newfound wealth and access to the conglomerate's resources discreetly. Of course, he insisted on using intermediaries, carefully obscuring his true origin, began to assemble a team of engineers, scientists, and technicians. He recruited disillusioned veterans from the conglomerate's research divisions, men and women who recognized the moral bankruptcy of their work and were willing to fight for a different future. He also subtly employed the absolute zero, a carefully orchestrated disruption here, a frozen overvalve there to subtly influence projects, steering them towards sustainable solutions. But the conglomerate, predictably, wasn't idle. Silas, consumed by rage and a desperate desire to regain control, unleashed a wave of surveillance and intensified the harassment of Kaelen and his team. The Sun Kings, under the watchful eye of a newly appointed, ruthlessly efficient Captain Thorn, escalated their tactics. They began staging accidents, deliberately destabilizing equipment, sabotaging prototypes, attempting to discredit and isolate Kaelen's burgeoning operation. One evening, while working late in the sanctuary, a tremor ran through the glass walls, triggered by a sonic disruption. A squad of Sun Kings, led by Captain Thorn himself, stormed the workshop, weapons drawn. Before Kaelen could react, Mira unleashed a wave of precisely aimed bursts of supercooled mist, freezing the air and stunning the attackers. "You're playing a dangerous game, Kaelen," Thorn growled, his face a mask of icy fury. "You're interfering with the natural order." "The natural order you created is one of suffering and control," Kaelen retorted, his voice devoid of emotion. He raised his hand, and a delicate frost formed around Thorn's weapon, rendering it useless. "That's a natural order I intend to dismantle." As Thorn struggled against the effects of the absolute zero, Kaelen felt a distinct shift within himself. The connection to the martial art was deepening, becoming more intuitive, more resonant. The shimmer around him intensified, and for a brief, disorienting moment, he saw not through his eyes, but through the absolute zero, a vast network of frozen energy extending across Viridia, a subtle web of control woven by the conglomerate, reaching into every corner of the city. It was a chilling confirmation of his suspicions. He lowered his hand, the frost dissolving, and addressed Mira, his voice strained. "They're not just fighting us, Mira. They're fighting the very essence of what we're trying to create. They understand the power of stillness, the potential for control. We need to be prepared." He looked at her, a new urgency in his eyes. "We need to be ready to silence the echo of their stillness, once and for all." Chapter 14. The Echo of Stillness. The aftermath of the equinox drought had settled into a tense, brittle quiet. The Sun Kings, reeling from Kaelen's sudden, devastating display of power, were reduced to a nervous, watchful presence. Helios, stripped of his authority, and forced to labor on the glacial shelves of the southern continent, was a broken man, his crimson uniform stained with frostbite and shame. His command, once a whirlwind of aggressive intent, now consisted of a muttered obsession with the shivering beast and a fervent prayer for a thaw. Kaelen, meanwhile, had transformed the slums of Viridia's equatorial district into something akin to a fortress. Utilizing the conglomerate's dormant terraforming technology, initially designed for atmospheric manipulation, had subtly shifted the microclimate, creating pockets of localized cold, reinforcing his control. It wasn't a show of force, not overtly, but a silent demonstration of his capabilities, a chilling reminder of the power he held. Mira, initially overwhelmed by the revelation of Kaelen's heritage, had adapted with remarkable speed. The chaos of the immediate aftermath had galvanized her. She had organized the slum dwellers, leveraging her knowledge of the city's plumbing and sanitation systems into a surprisingly effective defensive network. Utilizing the principles of rapid cooling techniques gleaned from Kaelen's demonstrations, she had fashioned a series of intricate frost traps around key strategic points, capable of stunning and immobilizing attackers with localized blizzards. Tonight, however, the air hung heavier than the usual humid blanket. Kaelen, along with Mira and a small hand-picked team, a grizzled veteran of the conglomerate's ancient martial arts program, named Jian, and a wiry, quick-thinking engineer called Lin, were conducting a reconnaissance mission along the western docks. The docks, the primary conduit for goods entering and exiting Viridia, had become a focal point of unrest, a hub of corruption and illicit trade that the Sun Kings were attempting to pacify through brute force. They moved with a disconcerting grace, almost as if they were gliding across the cobblestones. Kaelen, ever mindful of the subtle shifts in the absolute zero, was scanning the area, not just with his eyes, but with the expanded awareness granted by the martial art. He saw the anxieties etched onto the faces of the dock workers, the barely concealed readiness of the Sun King's patrols, the intricate network of surveillance devices hidden within the shipping containers. "There," John hissed, pointing towards a heavily guarded warehouse. A contingent of at least 20. Heavily armed, plasma rifles, standard issue, and unusual. I detect a resonance, a faint echo of stillness. Thorn, a former enforcer of Helios, had been a persistent thorn in Kaelen's side, driven by a raw, almost primal distrust. Had been shadowing the team for days, a silent, relentless presence. Tonight, he and his men were positioned at the warehouse entrance, weapons drawn, faces grim. "You're playing a dangerous game, Kaelen," Thorn growled, his face a mask of icy fury. "You're interfering with the natural order." "The natural order you created is one of suffering and control," Kaelen retorted, his voice devoid of emotion. He raised his hand, and a delicate frost formed around Thorn's weapon, rendering it useless. "That's a natural order I intend to dismantle." As Thorn struggled against the effects of the absolute zero, Kaelen felt a distinct shift within himself. The connection to the martial art was deepening, becoming more intuitive, more resonant. The shimmer around him intensified, and for a brief, disorienting moment, he saw not through his eyes, but through the absolute zero, a vast network of frozen energy extending across Viridia, a subtle web of control woven by the conglomerate, reaching into every corner of the city. It was a chilling confirmation of his suspicions. "They're not just fighting us, Mira," Kaelen said, his voice strained. "They're fighting the very essence of what we're trying to create. They understand the power of stillness, the potential for control. We need to be prepared." He looked at her, a new urgency in his eyes. "We need to be ready to silence the echo of their stillness, once and for all." Suddenly, the air around them crackled with an unnatural cold. Lin, ever vigilant, reacted instantly, unleashing a concentrated blast of supercooled mist from her modified respirator. The mist enveloped Thorn, freezing his limbs with shocking speed. He roared in frustration, struggling against the icy grip, before collapsing onto the cobblestones, encased in a shimmering shell of frost. "You're playing a dangerous game, Kaelen," Thorn gasped, his voice muffled by the expanding ice. "You're playing with forces you cannot comprehend." Kaelen didn't flinch. He simply met Thorn's gaze, his eyes radiating a chilling intensity. "Perhaps," he said, his voice laced with quiet power, "but I'm starting to think I'm the one who doesn't understand." He raised his hand, and the frost around Thorn intensified, consuming his weapon and spreading across his body. Thorn screamed, a sound abruptly cut short as the absolute zero claimed him. Chapter 15. Echoes of the Stillness. The rain in Viridia had stopped, but the air remained heavy, thick with the metallic tang of frozen death. The aftermath of Thorn's demise hung over the courtyard like a shroud, the slick cobblestones stained with iridescent frost. Lynn, still recovering from her mist blast, meticulously cleaned her respirator, a frown etched on her face. "He was right, Kaelen," she said, her voice clipped. "The conglomerate doesn't just control water. They've been subtly manipulating the very flow of kinetic energy, the movement of heat, of air, of stillness. It's a feedback loop, a way to anticipate and neutralize threats before they even manifest." Kaelen didn't respond immediately. He was studying the frozen husk of Thorn, observing how the absolute zero had not simply frozen him, but fractured his molecular structure, leaving a brittle, almost crystalline silhouette. "It seems we've stumbled into a far deeper game than simply stopping Captain Helios," he murmured, his fingers tracing the outline of a particularly intricate ice formation on Thorn's arm. "This isn't just about freezing weapons. It's about freezing thought." Suddenly, a ripple of cold spread outwards from Kaelen's hand, intensifying the frost coating Thorn. A thin, high-pitched whine filled the air, the sound of the absolute zero straining against its limits. Kaelen had pushed it too far, experimenting with the technique in a confined space, and the resulting surge of power was manifesting as a localized temporal distortion. The ice around Thorn wasn't just solidifying, it was aging, crumbling into dust with unsettling speed. "Stop!" Mira shouted, her voice laced with alarm. She had been observing the scene with growing concern, a strange, almost mournful expression on her face. She rushed forward, activating the integrated stabilizers in her salvage filtration unit, aiming a concentrated pulse of warm air at the frozen tableau. It was a desperate maneuver, a localized attempt to disrupt the chilling effect. But it was too late. The temporal distortion surged, and Thorn's body didn't simply disintegrate. Instead, he shifted. Not physically, but in time. He became a ghost of his former self, a fragmented echo of the man he was moments before, caught in a loop of agonizing, slowed movements. He clawed at the encroaching frost, screaming a voiceless plea, while the air around him shimmered with fractured images of his own death. Kaelen, witnessing this horrific display, felt a surge of primal fear. He hadn't intended to inflict such a violent, devastating effect. The absolute zero wasn't merely a weapon, it was a fundamental force, capable of unraveling causality itself. He instinctively recoiled, attempting to quell the spiraling energy, but the damage was done. "This is uncontrolled," Lynn stated, her voice tight with urgency. "The conglomerate's network, they've anticipated this. They've built in fail-safes, countermeasures to prevent this level of temporal instability." Before Kaelen could respond, a figure materialized from the swirling frost director Lyra, Kaelen's sister, her face a mask of calculated composure. She wore the immaculate, silver uniform of the High Directorate, and her eyes held an unnerving stillness. "Brother," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "This is regrettable. You are demonstrating a concerning level of instability. The absolute zero is a tool of last resort, not a toy." She moved with a chilling efficiency, extending a hand towards Thorn. With a single deliberate gesture, she suppressed the temporal distortion, freezing thorns fragmented existence in a perfect, agonizing tableau. "We must secure this," she commanded, her gaze flicking towards Kaelen. "The potential ramifications of your enthusiasm are too great." Kaelen felt a wave of resentment, sharp and bitter. He hadn't been seeking to demonstrate his power, he had been responding to a direct, sadistic provocation. And yet, his sister, the woman he had once revered, was now viewing him with suspicion, with a cold, clinical assessment of his capabilities. "You are interfering with a perfectly legitimate investigation," Kaelen said, his voice low and dangerous. "Captain Helios' actions are a clear act of aggression, an assault on the people of this district. I was merely ensuring that justice is served." Lyra's lips curled into a barely perceptible sneer. "Justice? Your concept of justice is unconventional, brother. The conglomerate does not tolerate disruptions to its carefully calibrated order. We are here to ensure stability, to protect our assets." As she spoke, another ripple of cold emanated from Kaelen, weaker this time, but still potent. A small, perfectly formed ice sphere materialized in his hand, rotating slowly. He looked at it, then at Lyra, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "Perhaps," he said, his voice gaining strength, "the only way to protect our assets is to prevent them from existing in the first place."